It's the week ending Saturday the 25th of November, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Philip Hammond unveiling his budget in Parliament, Robert Mugabe resigning as President of Zimbabwe, and former Scottish Labour leader Kezia Dugdale entering the I'm a Celebrity jungle. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And with me from the week's digital team are Kari Wilkins, Rebecca Gillie and Mike Starling. And starting the show this week, it's Kari. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Should we protect our pronouns?
The reason I'm defending freedom of speech, because that's how people with different opinions settle their opinions in a civil society.
Peterson, do you have any comments on the Nazi presence at your protest? The presence of Nazis and white supremacists assaulting people at your protest. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I don't like Nazis. I'm speaking out the way I'm speaking out because I think this is a route to no violence. And violence is lurking. And you can say that that sounds like a threat.
There was no violence at our protest, though.
I just asked, would you refer to me if it wasn't for this law? And I asked you to refer to me with they, them pronouns, would you? And your answer was no.
Not if I was compelled to.
That was Professor Jordan Peterson speaking with protesters at the University of Toronto this week, filmed by activists, shown on CNN. Kari, what is the story here?
So this bloke, he's a psychologist, but he's also a very outspoken critic of transgender rights and what he would call PC culture generally. He's had a real go at the use of gender-neutral pronouns. He's been in the news this week because a Canadian university assistant got in major trouble with authorities at her university because she showed her class part of a TV debate featuring Peterson during a class on how language affects society.
Thank you, by the way, for referring my attention to that, because I had missed this story.
Yes, so that's why it's...
The audio recording of the session in which she was disciplined by her university for having used this clip of him is absolutely extraordinary.
She gets torn apart, doesn't she?
It was like the 10-minute conclusion of a kind of State of the Nation play at the Royal Court. I've never heard anything that so neatly and succinctly summarises the kind of liberal paranoia that's going on at the moment. And there are two well-intentioned people at a university debating whether or not she should have shown a YouTube video.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, apparently she's near tears in this video.
Yeah.
This was then made public and there was a major backlash. And the university president has apologised, but you get the impression purely because he's been caught out as opposed to not necessarily because that's what he actually believes, that they made the wrong call. So
there's the debate about whether or not at university, when people are adults, you're not talking about school children here, people should have a free debate in which they challenge ideas. There's that debate. But then there's also the debate about gender-neutral pronouns itself. Why is that such a hot topic at the moment?
Well, in June, Canada introduced this new bill called Bill C-16, which basically prohibits discrimination under the Human Rights Act on the basis of gender identity and expression. So that's now added to the list of categories in which it's illegal to discriminate against someone or publicly incite hatred, along with race, age, that sort of thing.
So let's be clear. So what are the words you're not supposed to use in Ontario anymore?
Well, this is where it gets a bit confused because basically C-16 doesn't actually declare definitions of gender pronouns or identity. It leaves that fairly vague, but it does say that it's based on the definitions declared by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, who've enacted something similar. And they do say that refusing to refer to a person by their preferred name or pronoun will likely be taken as discrimination. So in theory, you could be prosecuted for using the wrong pronoun.
So someone who's transitioned from a he to a she and then asks to be referred to as they, for example, and then you refuse to refer to them as they, you choose to refer to them as either he or she, you could be prosecuted for that.
In theory, you could be fined and even serve jail time.
Okay. Isn't it just natural, Rebecca, that even if you're well-intentioned and you say, OK, yes, that's a progressive step forward for the trans community over the next however many decades, it's going to take decades for people to adjust to that. For centuries, people have said he and she.
Yeah, but I would argue that Jordan Peterson is not a well-intentioned person in this respect. He's not by any means a neutral commentator who's just airing some concerns. He's really built up this massive following of being this anti-PC figure within the supposedly very PC world of academia. He's compared liberalism to, he says it's turning into authoritarianism, totalitarianism. He's compared using preferred pronouns to silent slavery. So he's not a neutral commentator at all on this subject. I mean, it will certainly take a while, obviously, for this kind of thing to become a mainstream accepted part of, everyday discourse. But, I think it will happen. And I think we've undergone similar things before. When Ms. was introduced in the 1970s and picked up by feminists and obviously became the title of Ms. Magazine, there was a backlash then. People said we don't need a neutral pronoun. Miss and Mrs. are completely fine. Even now, the editor of Debrett's says he doesn't use the word Ms. himself, and he refers to married women as Mrs. husband's name.
Well, but there you go. I mean, even if now the editor of Debrett says that, then it hasn't caught on, has it? It's taking decades to take shape. It is still quite uncomfortable to say Ms when you're talking informally.
It might be uncomfortable, but that's someone's identity, and I think that's the same with these gender-neutral pronouns. In that, it may not be according to your beliefs, but frankly, it's just a word for you. But for that person on the receiving end, that's their identity.
That's the crux of the debate, really, for me, away from the right-wing connotations. I think, actually, if someone says that that's what I want to be referred to by, that's their right.
Fine, but this particular university teaching assistant, there wasn't anyone in the room who said, please call me a particular pronoun, and then she ignored it. She just was having a debate about the use of language, and as part of that showed a video in which someone put the view that language is not something they should be compelled to say.
I think it's the attempt to frame it as a neutral discussion. Well, one side says this and the other side says this, and obviously if you are a transgender student, or, even if you're just, an advocate of transgender rights, then their identity is not a subject for debate. You can't say, well, on one side, maybe you should be referred to the way you want to, but on the other side, maybe that's just stupid and you're stupid. I would argue that it's not a neutral debate, and although I think that there is a case that, that the university officials may have overreacted, in this instance, she obviously did not intend to offend anyone or to cast transgender rights into dispute. There is a case perhaps of providing more context to these speakers before presenting their views and not trying to frame it as a simple, well, either side makes good points.
But we don't know that she didn't do that. For me, the issue raises more about how much language can be controlled, how much it should be controlled by the state, how much language affects our thinking.
Well, this is it, isn't it, Mike? You're talking about legislation. When you say you support it in theory, do you support legislation compelling people to use certain language? Is that really enforceable?
It's not, unfortunately. On a personal level, no.
There are certain words you can't, certain racial slurs, you can't use them.
But in context, if I said the N-word now and we were having a discussion about that word, that would be okay. If I called a black contributor that word, that would not be okay.
Well, it's the intent behind it, isn't it?
Intent, exactly. But intent gets lost in legislation. That's the point.
Exactly. I mean, I think in university classes, they are adults. They should be talking about all different views of society, and that's a big thing there. But if you look at France, for example, talking about of language and pronouns,
so everything's gendered.
This is just another debate altogether. I mean,
and they're having that debate over there. There are people who are saying that they need to sort of make the language more sort of gender neutral. But it's like, how far do you go? Do you rewrite the whole language?
But what is the thinking behind? I mean, it's weird anyway to an English ear that a table is either male or female. But since it is in France, I mean, why then have a debate about whether it's masculine or feminine?
The debate is more, why should it be gendered? Why this obsession with gender? Can we not just have gender neutral? And I think there's an argument that we need a non-gendered pronoun for everyone. I think possibly whether that's just using they rather than saying he goes, just they go. It's not necessarily grammatically brilliant, and it's, possibly it's ambiguous, but then so's you, and you can use that as singular or plural.
Fundamentally, it's about equality, right? If you're paying the same amount of money to go to university as anyone else, then you should have the same experience as them. And if you're going to a class taught by a professor who refuses to address you in the way you want to be addressed, imagine if you turned up and someone started calling you by a different name and said, well, I don't want to call you by your actual name, I'm going to call you what I think you should be called.
Yes, but if you're going to a university class about critical thinking and you're presented with a view you disagree with, that's not grounds for complaint.
Yeah,
surely.
But if you're...
That's different to a professor refusing to call you personally by your pronoun.
Yes, but it's legitimising that viewpoint as a legitimate way to behave, which I don't think it is. And the fact still being that if you're...
But I mean, in politics, are you legitimising communism by discussing communism?
No, but the thing is, it's not a subject. It's really, you're not discussing a concept, you're discussing people. And if you're white, straight, identify with the gender you were born as, your existence and your legitimacy are never going to be a subject of debate in an academic class.
I don't think that's right. I think there's such paranoia about this now that it seems to me that's almost all students are talking about at the moment is whether people are too privileged or whether they state their privilege.
I think that's
and
a
what their status
minority.
is.
You know, that's still a minority of cases.
It's the big subject on university campuses. So you
but
can't say it doesn't get discussed.
It's not in terms of like what actually happens on university campuses. It's whenever something like this happens, the press sees on it and basically just try and bait conservative inclined people to be angry about it, the same way that it happened at Cambridge with I can't remember her name now, but a student there who said that there should be more diverse authors on the reading list, and the Telegraph picked it up, put her picture on the front page and said she was demanding that white authors be kicked off the reading list. These stories are always blown out of proportion, to try and incite people against them, really.
I think that's the danger of this law, C16. I think the problem is that it hasn't set down a consensus on what constitutes acceptable pronouns and I think that's the problem. You're just giving fuel to people like Peterson because he can sort of go, right, well, if you don't say Z or whatever rather than he, you're going to be prosecuted. And that's not what it's aiming to do. But because language is evolving, as language does, but at the moment there hasn't been a consensus agreed. And grammar's all about rules. It's a building block of language, but it's not set in stone.
That's the thing, isn't it, Mike? If you were writing an article and you're writing about a person who isn't transgender, so a transgender person wants they as the pronoun. If you used they to describe them, obviously that would be approved by your editor. If you were writing about a man who gave a speech at a conference and you used the word they said, and it was just a singular person, that would be picked up by a sub-editor as wrong, wouldn't it? That's incorrect. So, but actually,
as a sub-editor, actually, I think English is rich enough that we can cope with that simplification. There's ways round it if that became the agreed consensus. If we did it now, then yes, readers would look at it and go, "That's poor English."
That's wrong. That's incorrect.
But then maybe that's something we need to address. Language is there to serve us.
As a sub-editor, they has obviously for a long time been accepted as a recognised, if clunky, way to describe someone in the singular. But if, for instance, someone wanted to be known as je or je, and then one of us wrote that in an article, would that pass your...
It needs to become the agreed consensus, because if only some readers are going to recognise it and others are going to be like, well, that's a typo,
but does this
then it doesn't work.
In Canada, does that identify specific pronouns?
That's the problem.
Or does it say
and I think that's where this
pronouns?
falls down, and that's why people like Peterson can come out and go, well, someone can turn around and go, you've got to call me Grandmaster Jedi, and if you don't, I'm going to sue you. They need to clarify this, and this is where the language needs to be established. In the same way that since the 80s, it's no longer become acceptable in official documents to say that traditional assumption that he will do this, he will do that, that there's been this movement towards gender-neutral language, and that's really helped women. This isn't just a transgender issue. This is all about just not pigeonholing people, because, you make considered choices in your language, but when it comes to sex differences encoded in grammar, it's processed at a more unconscious level, and I think that raises the issue of how much gendered pronouns, whether we're conscious of it or not, whether they affect our thinking.
Right, you get a bonus point if any of you can tell me what cis means.
Is it basic sex you're born?
It's someone, who identifies as the gender they were assigned at birth.
So what's the context that would be used in? And have you ever used it to describe yourself?
I have never used it to describe myself, no. But it's the idea, again, it's kind of a language thing. For instance, there was a thing about the NHS releasing a leaflet where they talked about pregnant people rather than pregnant women because they didn't want to give the impression that all women could be pregnant or that the only pregnant people could be women. So
at the moment, only women can be pregnant.
Well, no, because you could be a transgender man who has all the equipment in place.
So you could have been born as a woman, then be transitioning
it's
to a
man.
man.
It's a way to specify when you're talking about people who were biologically born as the female sex.
But again, doesn't that presume that someone who's in an extreme minority is offended when that person may not be?
I don't know that they're necessarily offended, but it's just a way of being more inclusive, I suppose. It's like, TfL getting rid of ladies and gentlemen.
How many pregnant men are there? 1 or 2 a year? Is it necessary to spend a lot of money changing leaflets when those people encounter all kinds of prejudices in their daily lives?
You have to be careful not to alienate people.
But they're not going to be alienated by the use of
No, what
words
I mean is that you're
flyer.
trying to promote tolerance, but in fact all you do is build up intolerance in the sense that it gets other people's backs up.
Definitely. I think that there's a lot of people, whether it's lawyers or in-house HR people at companies, they are scared of offending people, and they will make changes, like you say, for the 0.1%, which is change is good, right? I mean, this is fact. I mean, we should be more inclusive, but like you said, Ollie, I mean, how far does it go?
And it's what results in the whole political correctness has gone mad discussion, doesn't it? Which is unfortunate.
Correctness, so much of the time, is just politeness.
Yes, but if people feel that there are cases where they're being pushed against the tide of what would naturally be happening anyway. This is going to happen in 10 or 20 years, but why are we doing it now?
But in terms of gender, why do we need to have the gender? Why can't we have a gender-neutral pronoun, an accepted one?
I still don't understand the context in which people are supposed to use the word cis. What's the sentence with it in?
I think you only use it in a sentence where your choice of assigned sex is relevant. If I'm opening
so
a bank
give me an
account, I
example.
don't need to say I'm a cis or I'm a non-cis. It's not
Okay,
relevant.
but where would you use it?
Well, let me give you an example.
Yeah.
So the other day, I was at Covent Garden. They were doing the Christmas light switch on, and they were talking about one of the shows at the West End. And they said, "Oh, we've got beautiful women here for the men, and we've got handsome men here for the women." And I thought straight away, that's a funny thing to say now, because you'd think you'd say, well, for the straight men, or you'd think, oh, and for some of the women,
odds are 10% of that audience are gay. According to
So what's that got to do with saying cis? When would you say cis?
So what I'm saying is, there are situations where it's inappropriate now to say just men or just women. Like if you're talking about beautiful women.
Right, but where would you say cis?
You'd say cis in situations where the biology is relevant. Okay, here's one. On Twitter, there was a thing about them saying all women know what it's like to have periods. And there was a backlash on Twitter saying that they should have really said that all cis women know what it's like to have periods, because it was
some women don't have periods.
Well,
for various reasons.
that was another spiral of that debate. But basically, in situations where women who are not biologically born women might feel excluded by conversations about what is common to all women, or in the opposite case to all men.
What I think's at the bottom of all this is, why do we have to define gender? Why can't it just be a person? There was an interesting brain imaging study where they found that a sentence such as "the electrician hummed as she worked" often elicits the same electrical activity, usually associated with the detection of a syntactic error, because we're being taught to think that electrician, male, whatever. Why do you have to even put a sex in there? It's just the person doing that job hummed. Why do we have to have any sort of gender issue or cis issue or whatever?
But that does mean teaching children, doesn't it, toddlers, to say my cis mum and my cis dad?
No, I absolutely not. I don't think.
Well, how do you define it otherwise then? How do you get into the habit of using it?
For that child, the sexuality or the gender leaning or whatever of their parent is not the relevant point. You use that word or those terms, whatever, when it's relevant.
But you're saying don't mention gender, so why not just say my parent?
My mum and dad,
but that is gendered, isn't it?
All right, my whatever you want to call my boo boo and whatever you call your parents, just use their names.
But why is that better?
It's like if you were to say men find X woman attractive, it would be more appropriate now, most people would say, to say straight men and
straight cis men.
Straight men.
But who's offended by that qualifier not being there?
Because why not just people find her attractive?
Yeah.
Again, coming back to it, why does it have to be this sex does, this sex doesn't? Let's all get into our nice compartments. Why not just people find her attractive?
Mike.
I agree. I'm with Kari on this one. I just think we're overcomplicating things in some aspects of the debate. But like say, if it's actually relevant to that person, then yes.
Yes, if it's relevant. But if it's not, then it's their sex, gender, leaning, whatever. That is not the point. You just need a word that describes them, a person.
I think the danger is that well-intentioned people feel frightened to say things because they're going to offend someone.
Give an opinion. You don't have to be offensive.
But we're showing that it's
about
difficult to give an opinion, aren't we? We're showing that if you're discussing gender politics, there's heckles that go up that stop people saying what they think.
It's a very tricky issue.
But it never used to be a tricky issue. It should be something that people can just...
because the people who were being offended would just have to shut up.
It should be something that... To return to this teacher who showed the footage, it should be something you can have a discussion about, taking into account all the points that we've made. And I know you can... But people are just so quick to jump on it and say what is right and what is wrong in a situation where clearly everyone's trying to do the right thing rather than anyone trying to offend anyone.
But that's why it's ridiculous that they shut her down. She was simply trying to look at both arguments. The moment you shut it down, people have said this is all about news, Orwellian type news speak, that people are prescribing language. And yet that's exactly what they're trying to prescribe people's thoughts in shutting down this kind of debate.
Well, on that, we, he, she, I, they, we, cis, and everyone agree. Rebecca, you're next. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
The death of the killer who just won't die.
And we should say this clip does contain some disturbing content.
Did you love him?
Yes, I did.
Did he love you?
I always thought he did. Now I'm not so sure.
She says she was 14 when she met Manson, a man nearly 20 years her senior. She says within hours of meeting, he had sex with her.
It seemed very natural and loving.
Were you attracted to him?
He was cute, impish, fun. I needed that love and attention and affection.
Diane Lake there, former member of the Manson family, speaking to ABC News. Rebecca, Charles Manson died last week, so that's the story, but it was quite big news. Why are you bringing it to the podcast?
I think the aftermath of his death is what's been really interesting this week. The place that the Manson family still occupies in our popular culture. It's got me wondering, why are we still so fascinated with Manson?
Why are we still fascinated with Manson, Mike?
Because of film, because of newspaper articles, because of in-depth
why do we keep writing them and making them?
Because good people like to read about evil people. It's always going to happen. This is always.
But why him?
This is what gets me. There's been, so many more prolific serial killers, and also, of course, he famously
didn't actually do it.
Well, he was involved in a murder, but it wasn't the Tate Lubbock.
For those who are listening who actually don't know all about the Charles Manson murders, because I'm quite aware, actually, particularly younger people, a lot of them aren't.
Yeah.
Just talk us through the basic facts of what Charles Manson did do.
Okay, so he was a cult leader who kind of came up in the summer of love in San Francisco, and he attracted this coterie of mostly young female followers. They lived on a ranch together for a while, and then in August 1969, he basically arranged and ordered some of the cult members to carry out 2 home invasions and slayings. One was the famous murder of Sharon Tate, the actress who was 8.5 months pregnant when she was stabbed to death with some of her friends in her house.
With Roman Polanski's child.
Yes, and he was not there at the time. And then they also murdered a couple the next night, another home invasion. Manson himself did not participate in any of these murders, although he did participate in a separate one.
So your point being then, I mean, I agree with Mike, I think, in his analysis that that's just naturally fascinating, hasn't it? It does have lots of the ingredients that people are interested in. But your argument is, well, since he didn't literally stab anyone,
he didn't
or in the first
actually
murder,
kill anyone. But I think that's
what makes it fascinating. It's what did this man have that he could control people like this? Because on the surface, he's a bit of a loser. He was a failed rock star. He'd been in and out of prison all his life. He's a misogynist, white supremacist. How did he exert such power over these young girls?
He did have, I mean, you look at the pictures of him when he was arrested. He's quite charismatic in the photos, isn't he? He's a good-looking kind of rock and roll Californian guy.
All of the followers who have spoken to the press have said that they did completely fall under his spell. Famously, during the trial in 1971, some of the female followers who were, among the defendants, they laughed, they giggled, they pulled faces.
On the trial are really disturbing.
They acted very, very unusually, and at the time, obviously, it was a huge stir in the press because no one had ever seen this kind of behaviour in the court. But in the years since, they all renounced him when they were in prison. Many of them were model prisoners. That was another thing that makes it fascinating. Is so they were mostly middle-class, white, young women. Leslie Van Houten, who participated in the second night of murders, was a former homecoming queen. Yeah. That's what I think is at the root of the fascination, is that these so-called good girls were able to so quickly fall under his spell and carry out the killings themselves are just incredibly gruesome.
You hear Diane Lake in that clip there, as you say, that they renounced him officially, but I mean, clearly she's still a little bit enamoured with him now when she talks about him.
Yeah, it's fascinating how you can... that memory is still so strong for so many of them. To be clear, Diane Lake didn't participate in any murders. All these women who have this such strong memories even now are falling under his spell. And I think that is something that, as a society, we are still fascinated by powerful men and the influence they can exert over female followers.
Perhaps there's an element of self-defense in that, this woman, okay, she didn't actually carry out the crimes, but for these women to admit that actually I did it and it wasn't his influence, that would be to admit terrible evil in themselves, and maybe that's what fascinates us, that you kind of have this blame figure.
Is there anything wrong with media and publishers putting these stories out there? Because, Mike, as you say, people are naturally fascinated. Yeah. It is clickbait.
And also, he's not the only one, is he? I mean, let's just looking generally, you have a lot of serial killers who make the documentary list pretty good watching every year.
Voyeurism, isn't it? Maybe it's a release. We'd never do it ourselves,
Charles
but
Manson,
it's a bit of a...
to use a pun, he has this cult following. People listen to his records that he made in the 1960s. People read he wrote lots of letters from prison in which he basically tried to justify himself. He does have this cult following. He does seem to have this...
Celebrities, aren't there?
Yeah, there's a sort of almost personality cult around him still. People are more fascinated with him as a person, I think, than they are with other famous serial killers. He's really got this whole pop culture legacy around him. I mean, there've been films, there've been books. The book written by the prosecutor in the Tate LaBianca trial is the best-selling true crime book of all time.
It's like 7 million copies
Yeah,
or something.
there's even an opera about Manson.
Is it also
Quentin
because...
Tarantino's making a movie with the Manson murders as the backdrop.
Oh, really? Is it also because we're not supposed to glorify violence? The whole point of having a trial system and then people going to prison is we're supposed to say these people are degenerate and that maybe they need help. Maybe in the case of California, they actually get put to death, although Manson managed to escape that. But whatever the solution is, they should be taken out of our society. And yet we're intrinsically actually sort of naughtily fascinated with them.
It's getting your kicks in quite a cheap way, while at the same time sort of tut-tutting and saying, oh, isn't it shocking? But, oh, yeah, can we have a few more details? And there is something quite disturbing about
50
that.
years later, people are still talking about the documentaries and the stories and the press and the actual stories around each person, not especially the murders.
And there's something unsettling about it in the Manson case, particularly because he was such an attention seeker. You know, that's all he wanted was fame. He famously occupied Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys' house and basically refused to leave until the family decamped to their notorious ranch. And he got Dennis Wilson to let him go and use the recording studio. He wanted to put out these albums and become as big as the Beatles. He's obsessed with the Beatles. And so now, you know, he did for 50 years. He managed to enjoy the notoriety that he had always wanted, which I think is an unsettling element of the story. He wanted to be a pop culture figure, and that's exactly what he got.
Is he part of a dying breed, though? I mean, have we lost the cult leader now? I mean, is that why people quite like this story? Because it reminds us that this was possible in the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's got all the elements of the kind of underbelly of the late 60s going into the seedy 70s that, you know, that people really enjoy. He kind of embodied that transitional era where everyone kind of realised that the hippie movement wasn't necessarily always cut out to be, and we moved into a kind of grimmer time. I think there'll always be cases like this where manipulative people are able to convince other people to carry out their dark intentions. But I do think that we are, fingers crossed anyway, I think we are transitioning into an era where we are more interested in the victims and more respectful of the victims and maybe less overly lurid about the crimes themselves. Although I think that's still the fascination.
I think also part of his fascination, he belonged to a sort of a, paradoxical as it sounds, he belonged to a more innocent time where he did have this influence and sort of these wide-eyed young girls. And I think people now are more cynical and more questioning because we've seen that darker side of life. We're more aware of it. So perhaps that makes it less likely that there will be his like again.
And finally, this week, it's our own one-man cult. Mike, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
A dive into the unknown for football rules.
You know, I've worked with him for a year now, and you know, he would always take an opportunity if it was presented to him to take a shot on because he wants to score goals. So, you know, I saw there was contact. The referee was there, saw there was contact. Umar said there was contact. Now, contact or slight contact, it doesn't matter. There was contact.
How would you sort of rate your confidence levels that the ban will be rescinded, if you like, and no further action will be taken?
I'm not sure. Other people will make that decision, and we will have to accept the outcome of that decision.
That was Everton boss David Unsworth discussing striker Umar Niasse, who's become the first Premier League player to be charged by the FA for successful deception of a match official. Mike, what does that mean?
He's actually been banned now. The charge has gone through, it's been approved, and he will miss 2 games because in the match against Crystal Palace, he was charged with successful deception of a match official. In theory, diving to win a penalty. That's what happened.
Okay, what's it got to do with the match official?
Well, the match officials didn't actually do anything during the game. They gave a penalty, Everton scored, but after the game, it went to a video appeal where a panel of 3 or 4 people then retrospectively ruled that he had cheated.
So, but the deception was he was blocking their view deliberately?
No, he decepted the referee by trying to win a penalty when it wasn't actually a foul. That's
This is a significant moment if you're a football fan, because this is presumably something we're going to see much more.
Yeah, I mean,
regularly.
it won't be the first one this month. It'll be the first of many and many and many, and this is in the Premier League.
And did it affect the outcome of the match?
Absolutely.
So the penalty was...
But did it win the match
Yeah.
for them?
No, it was 2-2, but if Palace had won the game, they are going to go down, it looks like, if they lose out by 2 points, and they might go back to that
So
game.
the score was changed retroactively from...
No, the score will never change. The score will never change. That score line of 2-2 will stay.
So they won't take the penalty back?
No.
Okay.
This is it. The score will stay the same. But
So
if Palace miss out by 2 points at the end of the season, they can then say, but we missed out on that penalty, but then there will be other things against them throughout the season.
So this could just result in more tactical diving then, couldn't it? More tactical cheating?
It's still kind of worth it.
Yeah.
No, I think the referees will be... They've already started to clamp down on it anyway.
But is there some pride for football fans? I mean, not that they're going to be singing from the terraces, "Way, successful deception," but is there some pride for football fans that actually you have successfully deceived and therefore got the point? Well, I mean, are the fans on side, basically?
I think the fans are on side. People don't want to see cheating. No one wants to see cheating. And diving's one of the worst things, because it's like, there has got to be some sort of fair play to sport. And there's nothing worse than losing or win. Actually, it's probably worse winning because of your players cheated. But if something does happen in the game, this ruling does show that 2 days later, you might be able to challenge it and say, and the FA and the Premier League will say, actually, we're going to put this to the video panel and we'll decide on it.
But will this actually reduce this sort of the incidence of diving, or do you think it's more instinctive that these people are trained to go after the ball, whatever, and they dive and they're not necessarily thinking about the repercussions?
I mean, as a kid, you don't learn to dive. You don't want to cheat. But when the stakes are high, if you can just leave your foot in and get a bit of contact to win that penalty and win you that game or that quarter-final of the World Cup, well, you know.
Isn't it worth maybe taking the punishment sometimes?
Well, this is it. So you raised the quarter-final of the World Cup. Yeah. What impact would this have had if you went retrospectively back far enough? I mean, it's all very well saying 2 days, but if you go back 20 years and say, right, they don't get that trophy anymore.
Maradona.
Tell us more.
Handball, wasn't it? Hand of God. The world seen he handballed it. Referee didn't. But the result would still stay the same. I think that's the key. They're not going to have a change unless they're not going to have a replay, because that would be ridiculous.
I don't think Hand of God would have been any less notorious if he'd had like a 2-match ban afterwards. You know, it doesn't seem like it goes far enough. But then I suppose they're worried about opening the can of worms of saying, well, actually, no, we're going to take 1 point off. You actually now have lost this game, and now we're going to adjust the league table accordingly.
How soon after the match? How far ahead? You know, could they be 5 days down the line and then suddenly get this ban? So they couldn't have played another game afterwards.
Yeah, it's got to be raised before the next game. Okay. And I think in this situation, it's usually raised on the night of the game, because either the fans are talking about it or the FA's talking about it. So.
Okay, 2 obvious questions here. 1, is this the end of diving in football? And 2, surely this whole business about getting a panel together to watch a video is weird when the crowds and the people on telly are watching the video in real time. Yeah. So why not just do it at the time?
Well, absolutely. So diving will stay. I want it to stay. You know what I mean? It is part of the game, and people are going to try and win penalties by a little bit of cheating. That will happen. But it's up to the referees to then do it on the pitch. And I think if you look at the actual retrospective bans, I think more needs to be done within the game time. In-game video technology, that's the other debate.
But they're not allowed to, are they? The referees aren't allowed to look at the same video that everyone else is.
And they should be. They do it in cricket. They do it in cricket. They do it in rugby. And also, most stadiums have got screens in the corners now, and they have to be wary of not showing that replay, because if something happens, if there's 40,000 fans baying for blood.
Yeah.
But what's the reasoning behind not letting the referee see that?
They've never had to do it.
And referees get a lot of stick these days, especially online on social media. Makes it easier for people to kind of lob this abuse at them.
Well, and also there's the issue about the sort of jumpers for goalposts kind of purity of playing the beautiful game, isn't there? That if you bring video technology into it, that somehow it doesn't have its links with the game that everyone plays growing up.
Yeah, well, this is it. We were talking about this earlier. I'm a qualified referee. I played football.
Are there no ends to your talent?
And I played football to a decent standard, and when you play on the park pitches in Fulham, or if you play at a school's pitch, you do play for the love of it. When it gets to the Premier League level and when it gets to World Cup level, it's a business then. There's business decisions, and there's a lot more riding on it, whether it's the fans' passion or whether it's just winning a trophy.
And in your refereeing experience, did you get a lot of stick for your decisions?
Absolutely. Actually, it wasn't me getting the stick, it was the kids getting the stick. I stopped the game and told the parents to leave the side of the pitch. I'd like
parenting.
for a retrospective ban on the parents. I think that's the key.
Right, well, on that, I'm going to blow the whistle.
No worries.
Orange halves for everybody. Well done, lads. That's it for this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Mike Starling and Rebecca Gillie and Kari Wilkins. No pronouns necessary. For more from The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk, where you can also sign up to our free email newsletter. It's called The Weekday. Or you can also have the magazine delivered direct to your door. Just head to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. All our previous episodes are available on our podcast feed. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.